We're going to be continuing our series dealing with the background and situation in relation to the current Gaza conflict. Hoping this has been useful for you in understanding some of the facts and complexity. I understand some of this is very confronting, but I think it's important for people to understand what it is we're talking about. And we're going to continue this week by doing a bit of a deeper understanding of some of the dynamics that are at play that make it difficult, and also that there is an understanding for people who want to really advance progressive causes or who want to work with, for example, a Palestinian state to create a better future for Palestinians, to understand some of the challenges and threats that they face that are emerging too in the context of this context. So now I'm going to talk to you about the particular situation of the LGBTQI communities in Gaza and even in the West Bank. I'm going to tell you the story of Ahmed Abu Makia, who was a 25-year-old young Palestinian man. And Ahmed was a gay Palestinian who was living in the West Bank in Hebron, family there. And he, obviously knew and understood that he had to keep that quiet, and everybody has to if you're living in even the West Bank. There are two threats that you will face if it becomes known that you are a gay or lesbian person. Either you will be dealt with by your own family, who will be shamed and horrified by that revelation, or you will be the target of Hamas operatives that exist on the West Bank as well. So this is what happened to Ahmed. He had to flee. He was outed as being gay in the West Bank, and he moved around at first to get the West Bank looking to try and hide, but members of the family kept tracking him down, and he was outed in those locations, so he fled into Israel. Now, one of the things that people won't know is that at any given moment there are around 2,000 odd Palestinian gay people living in Israel, being sheltered by Israel in an asylum seeker program. And there are two organisations that really look after these people, dedicated to looking after them, the Israeli group Elim and a group called Al-Bayt Al-Mukhtalif, the Different House in English. And so these organisations exist specifically to look after Palestinian gay people fleeing persecution or threats to their life. And Rita Petrenko, who came from a Russian Jewish background, founded Different House. And it's a non-profit organisation. They do a lot of advocacy work for these gay people. And also they're involved in a program of seeking asylum places for them in safe countries that include Australia, but also Canada and other places. And so it's a successful program, and one that is the lifeline that wouldn't otherwise exist for these Palestinian LGBTQI people. And recently they managed to advocate to get the Israeli Supreme Court to effectively set up situations where also work rights would be granted to these people, so that they could earn a living while they were in a situation in Israel before they could be placed in other locations. So they have that ability now. So a lot of effort and love goes into supporting these people in Israel. So we know that anti-gay killings are rare in the West Bank as much as they are very common in the Gaza Strip and, of course, elsewhere in the Middle East, and we'll talk a lot about Iran in that respect soon. But they say that there are a lot of unreported killings of gay people, even in the West Bank, because some of these killings are disguised, described as accidents, etc. So we don't really know the full scale of what's happening there, but we do know that it's not a safe place to be, and there are no rights acknowledging relationships as legal. There's really an existential threat for anybody who is openly declared in that respect. There was a Palestinian advocacy group called Al Cause, which is supported by some of their Israeli Arab colleagues in Israel. But they were prevented from protesting in the West Bank, and they were told that they couldn't do that because they violated Palestinian values. So there's a very deep cultural issue associated with this, and it plays out in interesting ways. So when we come to the Ahmed Makia situation, it really illustrates a lot of this, because they did actually eventually arrest the person that brutally slaughtered him, and he was beheaded. And there was imagery of that beheading, and sort of seen online. So one person was arrested for the brutal slaughter of poor old Ahmed. And so this person should have been put on trial by Palestinian Authority courts, because a lot of people also don't understand that there is, in some of the autonomous arrangements in the administration of the West Bank, Palestinian Authority has a lot of responsibility in relation to criminal jurisdiction and policing, etc. So, while proceedings were initially begun in that respect, they never went anywhere, and haven't to this day. So there is also a community dispute resolution process that exists there, and that involves, bringing disputing or I guess, victim parties and perpetrator parties together to try and resolve issues, sort out issues of compensation, etc. So there was a process like this instituted between the family of the alleged murderer and Ahmed's family. And so the leadership of this results from, elders being appointed to run that process. And in this case, Sheikh Walid Tawil was appointed. And the process itself is called the Sul process. And you see echoes of this in a lot of places. I ran into it in Somalia with the DIA framework. You get the Gachaka process in Rwanda, etc. So the situation there is unfortunate. It brings in these cultural biases and discrimination. So in that process, if the family of the perpetrator can show that the person who was the victim was gay, that would be a significantly mitigating circumstance for the perpetrator. And you would certainly miss out on all rights to compensation for their death. And so recently, National Public Radio from America did an interview with Sheikh Walid Tawil, and he said, effectively, look, gays have no rights in society, religion, or family in our society. He said the Quran condemns sex between men according to traditional readings of the text, and in relation to some sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, which prescribe death for gay people. So the Israeli media actually covered the fact that Ahmed was gay, and which wasn't widely known in the West Bank, but he had been, as I say, sheltered by Israeli community groups. And so, this story surfaced because those groups were worried about his safety. So the fact that it was covered by the Israeli media confirmed to this Sul process that he was gay. So within 24 hours, the public opinion that had been shocked by Ahmed's brutal murder and beheading swung completely the other way, and being against Anas, the alleged perpetrator of the crime, to being a supporter of him. And the pressure led up a lot, as is said by this Abu Asha, who's a member of the perpetrating family represented in these proceedings. So his mother, even in commenting on this, said, he was a very, very good-hearted person, and described him as a beloved son, but repeatedly denied that he was gay. So his family were really in denial about that. And obviously it plays into that Sul process. So in some ways you can see the incentive there too. But one of the family arbitrators said that, we know he wasn't gay. We don't have homosexuality in Hebron, was the comment. This is Abraham's city. It's a holy city. It wouldn't have homosexuals in it. And so, to see these kind of echoes, it reminds me of Ahmadinejad, former president of Iran, saying that there were no gay people in Iran. So denying completely at one point at a conference at Columbia University in the United States. So this is the sort of social cultural dynamic you have to deal with as well in these contexts. So it doesn't just exist in the Gaza Strip, but you can undersee it with this particular situation, you can see some of the cultural elements that underpin that attitude that Hamas builds on in the way that it deals with people in Gaza. So now I'll talk about also what creates that context in which Hamas operates and the ability to indoctrinate people, etc. We'll go into a bit of detail about that. But effectively, we talked about the dhimmi status previously in the deeper history, and that is not just about the Jews, but of course anybody who wasn't Muslim. And now Hamas takes that to another level by sort of denying even further rights, or even the right to life or the right to your faith, by those classes of people. But the creation of the concept of the second-class citizen is really important, because in modern times it meant that no Arab leadership and communities in general often felt that there's no way they would sit around a table with Jews, because they were of this second-class nature. So in their minds it would be humiliating to have to deal on equal terms with Jews. And so that's partly a reason why you couldn't have these successful peace negotiations and offers of two-state solutions and settlements, that have been before the world and before the parties to the conflict for many decades. So that is one of the inhibitors in having a level playing field for an actual meaningful engagement. It's beginning to evaporate in certain contexts, and you see the Abrahamic Accords, which we'll talk more about later, starting to accept the inevitability of an Israeli state and the fact that there's actually mutual benefit in dealing with them on equal terms. So you've got these situations of dhimmi status and all those limitations that were placed on them, as you can see there. But this cultural memory is part of the problem that we're dealing with. The other factor that we're dealing with when it comes to Hamas is, as I mentioned, this indoctrination issue. And as well as picking up a lot of the Nazi themes in their ideology and in the Covenant, they also picked up some tips on how to organise your society to be militaristic and inculcated or inoculated into the ability to kill and I guess desensitize yourself to what they want you to do. And that begins in Gaza at the age of 12. So they take children in Gaza at that age and begin their military training. And that doesn't mean toy weapons, it means real weapons of every kind. And so that process of training also comes with it Hamas indoctrination, which builds on a basis that already exists in relation to their education system. Now, this is not me saying this, it's not suggestions by, propagandists from anywhere. What is, I think, of great interest for people to read are the 5 European Parliament reports that have been, and studies that have been done into the education system in Gaza, which is also reflected, unfortunately, in the Palestinian Authority in terms of the materials they use. So this is actually one example of that, a page from a textbook which relates to the fact that the infidels are all condemned to be burnt in the fires of hell, etc. So these are the sorts of themes you will find in textbooks in Hamas, and these are the materials produced by UNRWA. So I mentioned the European reports. So those reports have been produced since 2016. They've been looking at this issue seriously. And a lot of them, the efforts at education materials and promoting education for Palestinians has been supported by European funding, European Union funding to the Palestinian Authority and to UNRWA specifically, including in the Gaza Strip. And those reports really have highlighted the need to be much more rigorous in that support and to submit it to much greater scrutiny. And they've demanded that those materials be modified, but to date that hasn't happened, although there has been a recognition recently, not only in the Palestinian Authority, but even Saudi Arabia has mentioned that they need to go back and redo these materials as a key factor in how we build pieces, how we break down these anti-Semitic foundations. And so, and in effect, not just anti-Semitic, but any diversity in effect. So the UNRWA schools, which cater for about 80% of the Gazan population, they produce additional educational material, which builds on some of those anti-Semitic elements you'll see in the general PA textbooks. And what's really disturbing to me is that you see this group, New South Wales Teachers for Palestine, who we heard audio recordings of discussing what they were planning to do in relation to the crisis over there, and really talking about using their classes to communicate Hamas propaganda effectively. So there was one recording of a maths teacher saying that they were going to use their maths classes to indoctrinate their students on, for example, Hamas casualty figures, which have been completely discredited now, and we will come back to talk about those in more detail later. But the most recent report the European Parliament issued on the 11th of April 2024 condemned specifically, they joined the dots between this material and what happened on October the 7th. So they condemned the hateful contents, spreading this anti-Semitism, inciting hatred in these textbooks, and the fact that the European Union was funding this stuff, again, they highlighted was just unacceptable. And they recognised that those materials had a role in radicalising Gazans prior to the October the 7th onslaught. And specifically said that it reaffirms in the context of the things that happened on that day, and we'll learn more about the details of October the 7th at a later date, but incredibly heinous, brutal, savage things that happen on that day. There are the ability for the human mind to be able to embrace and perpetrate those sorts of acts stems from this sort of indoctrination, this mindset that's created by these education materials. So they basically said that education to hatred has direct and dramatic consequences on the security of Israelis, as well as on the perspectives and prospects of a better future for young Palestinians. So this is just as much damage to young Palestinians as it is a terrible and horrendous consequence for Israelis. So we did talk about the way that Hamas has also abused and misdirected relief activities in the Gaza Strip. And that was going on a very long time before we've seen them looting and hoarding a lot of the food relief materials that just aren't finding their way to Palestinians, that they're using for their own military resources and sustainment and maintenance of Hamas fighters. So before the war, the European Union invested in installing water pipes. A lot of investment went forward into improving and creating an independent water situation for the Gaza Strip, and included desalination plants, etc. So a lot of Israeli sort of facilitation and assistance in that respect. So, but this is how Hamas dealt with that European aid to build water pipes, and what you're going to see is actually Hamas and a Hamas video on that subject. So let's have a look at that now. What you just watched there is a Hamas video boasting about how they dug up European Union water pipes and turned them into the rockets and missiles that they've been continuously launching for the last 18 years against Israel. And part of their ambition there, of course, is to make life in Israel unlivable, ruin their economy and depopulate it. As part of their ability to do that, of course, they constructed 500 kilometres of underground military infrastructure, fully aided by and supported by the Al-Quds force of Iran, and by funding from Qatar. A lot of the $1 billion that were funneled into Hamas from Qatar, supposedly for reconstruction and uplift, a lot of that money went into the construction of this 500-kilometre underground world that Hamas created. So it was also a venue for setting up weapons factories and manufacturing a lot of the ordnance that Hamas has been using. But in particular too, it was part of their smuggling routes under the border between Gaza and Egypt, where a lot of the supplies of materials and precursor materials come through, but also a major revenue stream for Hamas because of the taxes, in inverted commas, that they charge for materials coming through those tunnel systems. Understand too that with this sort of stuff going on in Gaza Strip with no Israeli presence, it comes back to this question of the application of things like the law of occupation, which we'll also talk about soon. But obviously, the effort, the investment, the money, the priority of Hamas was to create a military capability to repress their own people and to destroy Israel and be part of that Iranian network, that arc of terror that focuses primarily on Israel, but not exclusively. A lot of internal destabilization that goes on in various countries in the region. And the Hamas experience that we've been watching is just one manifestation of that. Of course, if you want to establish that there's been Israeli occupation of Gaza, you have to explain how it could possibly be effective control of that territory if they're able to launch the thousands of missiles they have and to do things like this and to run effectively a parallel state to the Palestinian Authority. Now, one of the really interesting aspects to this that you never see surfaced in discussion is that, yes, this would be the border between Gaza and Israel would be an international border and would be subject to all sorts of security and border controls in any event. So there being checkpoints for people to pass through into Israel from Gaza is one thing, which will remain and always remain as a normal part of international borders that exist in the region and between Israel and Gaza. But Gaza also shares a border with Egypt. And a lot of people don't refer to this. So if you're saying that, Gaza was the world's largest open-air prison is ridiculous, or I've even seen assertions that it's the most densely populated place on Earth. It never was the most densely populated place on Earth. It's not even in the top 200. There are multiple other places on Earth that are more densely populated. But the bottom line is that the city of Rafah, for example, in the south of Gaza, used to actually straddle that border into Egypt. And if you look at overhead footage and satellite shots now, you will see there is no second half of the city of Rafah in the Egyptian side of that border. It was completely demolished and bulldozed. And Egypt wants nothing to do with the Palestinians. It maintains this border structure. This is not part of Israel's security barrier in relation to the West Bank or Gaza. This is the Egyptian border with Gaza. And interestingly, this border structure is not to effectively stop Hamas. It's to effectively stop the Palestinian people from being able to move easily back and forth across those borders. Because we know from the pictures that I've just shown you, the tunnel arrangements that Hamas has to establish the ingress and egress routes across the Egyptian border as the main route for their supply and commercial operations and taxation regimes. So all of that is not being stopped by the Egyptian authorities. And there have been times when there's been attempts to regulate Hamas because, as I said, Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, which has been a major challenge for Egypt from time to time over years. And you'll remember when Muslim Brotherhood briefly occupied government even in Egypt, and as a consequence, of course, 60 Coptic Egyptian churches were either destroyed or severely damaged, and 45 Copts killed. It was heading in a very terrible direction, and then the Egyptians authorities sort of reassumed control. And they've had fights with Hamas on this border where up to 2,000 Egyptian soldiers have lost their lives. So this is the reality. If people criticise the passage of materials and people and the potential of Palestinians to seek refuge from the war effectively, then why hasn't there been attention focused on Egypt and their willingness to establish safe areas out of the way of the conflict between the IDF and Hamas? So let's have a look at some footage of this border so you'll get a proper appreciation of it. And the truth is that barrier that you see there has been replicated in about 3 or so layers heading into Egyptian territory, massively extensive and filled with all sorts of obstacles. So there's obviously a really serious intent on the Egyptians not to contribute to the safety of Palestinians in this conflict. Normally when you have a siege situation or a situation of intense conventional conflict like we've seen between Hamas and Israel, the normal situation would be for those forces, if they're operating in a humane way, to enable the passage of civilians to seek refuge from the heaviest of the fighting. That Egypt hasn't been prepared to do that. No other country in the region has been prepared to temporarily accept people like we did during the Bosnian War, where we accepted Bosnian Muslim and Serb and Croat people who were sheltering from the war, temporarily established a haven for them here in Australia, and a lot of them then returned when peace was established. No other country, no other Arab country has provided that kind of opportunity for Gazan civilians. And in fact, there are only a handful of countries in the entire region that have even signed the Refugee Convention. Those include Israel and, interestingly, Iran and Yemen, but no other country in the Middle East has signed those refugee conventions. And then you look at a country like Saudi Arabia, a country like UAE, a country like Qatar, vast financial resources, massive wealth associated with the petrol industry, the oil industry, could really basically set up all of these people sheltering from the conflict in temporary camps, or even build villas for them. They have that much money. But not one Palestinian has been able to seek that kind of refuge. We've seen some passage of people who require medical treatment at a higher level who've been allowed to pass through Rafah crossing, and also, of course, the Israeli crossings. But no scale solution to the conflict to ensure the safety of those civilians. So it's been left to Israel to try and construct temporary movements of people out of zones of operation and conflict, and zones that then get, unfortunately, compromised by Hamas operations. So this is the reality of the physical dynamics around the war in Gaza. We'll go back and do a very deep dive on the laws of armed conflict and international law issues that surround this conflict, because they've been among the most controversial elements of commentary that we've seen, and we'll explain what that's all about and what the deeper understanding that needs to be had in relation to the laws of armed conflict for people to make a judgment. And they're not things that a layperson or someone who's even a lawyer would understand if they are not deeply immersed in this body of law. So we'll come back and look at that in future programs. But for now, I hope this has given you some point of reference to understand the basis of the conflict and some of the dynamics that have caused the attitudes of parties as time has passed in the lead up to this, and some of the things that need to be addressed in the future, such as reforming education materials, which will take a generational approach to improve the standing of people to be able to communicate with each other in in a manner that will achieve long-term peace. So thanks for being with me, and I look forward to talking to you again next week when we'll move into that really interesting territory of the laws of armed conflict. Thanks.